The dusty, scorching August air of 1941 over the Ukrainian steppe seemed thick, like congealed resin. In the area of a small forest massif called Zelyona Brama, silence did not fall even at night, but it was not the silence of peace, but a heavy, oppressive anticipation of the finale. The commander of the 6th Army, Major General Pavel Ponedelin, looked at a map that for several days had borne no resemblance to reality. The front lines, neatly drawn in blue pencil, had turned into scattered dots, and the enemy's red arrows relentlessly converged, forming a ring from which there was no escape. Nearby, in the same stupor, was the commander of the 12th Army, Major General Mikhail Muzychenko. They did not yet know that in a few days their names would become synonymous with catastrophe in the High Command's reports, and their fates would become the subject of fierce historical disputes for decades to come. At that moment, near Uman, the fate of not just 2 armies, but the entire southern defense strategy of a vast country was being decided. And the weight of this decision fell on the shoulders of men whose hands were tied by orders from distant and cold Moscow. To understand how hundreds of thousands of trained fighters found themselves trapped among the golden wheat fields, one must return to the last peaceful days and the first weeks of that tragic summer. The southwestern direction was considered the most powerful in the Soviet defense system. Here, the best mechanized corps, a huge number of tanks and artillery, were concentrated. It was assumed that it was here that any attempt at aggression would not just be stopped, but crushed by a powerful counterblow that would transfer hostilities to enemy territory. However, the reality of the first days of the war dealt a crushing blow to these theoretical constructs. The German Army Group South, under the command of Field Marshal Rundstedt, did not act as expected by the Soviet General Staff. Instead of frontal clashes, they used the tactic of deep breakthroughs by tank groups, which, like steel needles, pierced the defenses and went into the rear, leaving infantry divisions to encircle pockets of resistance. By mid-July 1941, the situation on the southwestern front became critical. German troops captured Zhytomyr and Berdichev, creating a threat of a deep encirclement of Kyiv from the south. The Soviet 6th and 12th armies, covering the Vinnytsia direction, found themselves in a peculiar salient that became increasingly dangerous with each passing day. The logic of military art demanded an immediate withdrawal of troops to the east, across the Dnieper River, to straighten the front line and avoid encirclement. But in Moscow, a different logic prevailed. Directives coming from the Supreme High Command headquarters, signed by Joseph Stalin, demanded holding every meter of land, launching counterattacks, and in no case abandoning positions without special permission. This obstinacy of the supreme leadership became the first link in the chain of events that led to the Uman tragedy. The visible conflict on the battlefields developed rapidly. On August 1, 1941, General Kleist's 1st Panzer Group linked up with units of the 17th Field Army in the Pervomaisk area. This meant that the ring around the Soviet 6th and 12th armies had closed. Inside the cauldron were 24 divisions, including several tank and motorized formations. A huge mass of people, equipment, and horses was compressed into a small space that was constantly shelled by German artillery. Breakthrough attempts were made daily, but they were uncoordinated. Due to communication breakdowns, Army headquarters often did not know about the actions of their neighbors, and orders from front headquarters arrived several days late, by which time the situation had already fundamentally changed. The enemy's technical superiority in the air made any movement of Soviet columns impossible during daylight hours. German aviation literally paralyzed supply routes. Ammunition was running out, fuel for tanks was exhausted, and many formidable machines turned into immobile firing points or were simply destroyed by their crews during retreat. Food also became scarce. Soldiers, surrounded, were forced to eat what they could find in ruined villages. But even these resources quickly depleted. Despite this, resistance was fierce. Eyewitnesses from the German side recalled that Soviet soldiers fought with the desperation of the doomed, launching bayonet charges under heavy fire. The internal conflict that tore apart the command of the encircled armies was no less painful than the external pressure of the enemy. Generals Ponedelin and Muzychenko found themselves in a situation difficult for a modern person to imagine. On the one hand, they saw the real situation, the death of subordinates, the lack of resources, and the inevitability of defeat if they maintained their current positions. On the other hand, the experience of the repressions of the 30s weighed heavily on them. Each of them understood that any retreat without orders would be interpreted as cowardice or treason to the motherland, which would inevitably lead to the end of their lives before a firing squad of their own countrymen. This primal fear of the system that was supposed to protect them paralyzed initiative. Instead of showing generals' will and initiating a breakthrough at a time when the ring was still thin, they waited for sanction from above. The Stavka, located hundreds of kilometers from the front, operated with categories of prestige and political expediency. For Stalin, the surrender of right bank Ukraine was a heavy blow to the image of an invincible state. He demanded the impossible, to hold Uman, which was already deep in enemy territory. When permission to retreat was finally received, time was irretrievably lost. Retreat routes were cut off by Wehrmacht tank divisions, and the exhausted Soviet units no longer had the strength for a powerful breakthrough. In this clash between the personal duty of a military leader and blind obedience to a tyrannical will lies the main psychological drama of the Uman pocket. The army commanders found themselves caught between two millstones, the German blitzkrieg and Stalin's mercilessness. The ideological confrontation of this period of history reveals a deep paradox of the Soviet system. The army, which had been educated for years in the spirit of an offensive doctrine, was completely unprepared for conducting mobile defense in conditions of encirclement. The very idea of being encircled was considered seditious in the pre-war years. Ideology dictated that the Soviet soldier always moves forward. When reality confronted this belief with the brutal practice of encirclement, a systemic crisis ensued. Soldiers and officers saw how familiar dogmas collapsed, and this gave rise to a feeling of abandonment. Why wasn't powerful aviation covering them from the sky? Where were the promised reserves? Why did the front command promise help that never came? The philosophical conflict also lay in the very approach to the value of human life. For the German command, encircling the enemy was a mathematical problem of destroying manpower with minimal own losses. For the Soviet leadership, the same people were merely a resource to be burned to buy time. The Uman pocket became a place where two systems of total war clashed. But it was the Soviet model of governance in those days that demonstrated its inefficiency in the face of a sudden crisis. Excessive centralization of decision-making led to the fact that a huge military mechanism turned into an uncontrollable mass as soon as the threads of communication with Moscow were broken. The turning point came on August 5, 1941. The command of the encircled group made a final desperate attempt to break through in the eastern and southeastern directions. The area around the village of Podvysokoye and the Zelenaya Brama forest massif was chosen as the main point of attack. This was a territory crisscrossed by deep ravines and gullies, which offered some chance of shelter from aviation, but at the same time hindered the movement of equipment. Here, tens of thousands of people accumulated over several square kilometers. On this day, it became finally clear that an organized front no longer existed. The armies had disintegrated into separate detachments, led by officers who maintained their composure. At this critical moment, what would later be called the chaos of Zelenaya Brama occurred. General Muzychenko was severely wounded during one of the attacks and captured while unconscious. General Ponedelin, attempting to gather the remnants of units for a final push, was also captured by the enemy. The command was completely decapitated. Soldiers, seeing that their leaders were no longer in control of the situation, continued to fight in groups, trying to slip through German barriers under the cover of night. Those who failed to escape found themselves pressed against the Sinuka River. The water in the river, according to the recollections of survivors, turned crimson from spilled blood, and the banks were strewn with abandoned weapons and documents. The climax of the battle came on August 7th and 8th. German units began a systematic cleansing of the territory. Huge columns of prisoners stretched westward. According to various estimates, about 110,000 people were captured, including corps and division commanders. This was an unprecedented defeat. As trophies, the enemy received hundreds of guns and tanks, many of which were abandoned simply due to a lack of ammunition and fuel. Thousands of those whose lives ended in these fields remained on the battlefield. The Uman Pit, that's what the temporary prisoner camp set up in a clay quarry of a brick factory was called. The conditions there were beyond human comprehension. People were in the open air without food and water for many days, dying from exhaustion and wounds. For the Soviet leadership, acknowledging the scale of the disaster meant admitting their own mistakes. Therefore, the path of slandering the dead and captured was chosen. On August 16, 1941, the infamous Order Number 270 appeared, in which Generals Ponedelin and Kirillov were declared deserters and cowards who voluntarily surrendered. Their families were subjected to repression, and they themselves, while in German camps and refusing to cooperate with the enemy, were zaochno sentenced to the highest penalty in their own country. This was the last, most bitter act of the Uman Cauldron drama, when the homeland betrayed those whom it had deprived of the ability to defend themselves with effective orders. The resonance of the events near Uman is still felt today as we analyze the mechanisms of accountability of the authorities to the people and the army. The Uman catastrophe became a harsh lesson in what happens when political ambitions and ideological blindness are placed above military expediency and common sense. A direct consequence of the defeat near Uman was the collapse of the entire defense on the southern flank of the Soviet-German front, which ultimately allowed the Germans to encircle Kiev in September of the same year, where the scale of losses became even more horrifying. This was a chain reaction of defeats, triggered by incompetence at the very top. Today, looking back at the events of August 1941, we see a universal human truth. The heroism of ordinary soldiers cannot compensate for systemic leadership failures. The 100,000 people who remained in the Uman land or endured the horrors of captivity became victims not only of enemy force, but also of the state's internal paranoia. The lesson of Uman lies in the necessity of critical thinking and personal courage, not only on the battlefield, but also in staff offices. The true patriotism of a military leader lies in the ability to say, quote, "Zero to a ruinous order," even if immediate reprisal follows. Unfortunately, that summer, the system was structured such that such courage was paid for with life twice, both before the enemy and before one's own. Concluding this journey through the fields of Uman, we return once again to that very green Brahma, where in dust and heat the fates of thousands of families were decided. History is not just dates and numbers written on paper. It is, first and foremost, the living breath of people caught in impossible circumstances. The dust of those roads has long settled, the fields are once again sown with wheat, but the silent reminder of the price paid for the stubbornness of some and the fear of others remains with us. Every time we face the need to choose between a convenient lie and a bitter truth, the invisible image of a general looking at a map that can no longer save him rises before us. Understanding the true causes of the Uman pocket is not just an homage to memory, it is an attempt to safeguard the future from the repetition of such scenarios, where human life becomes small change in the games of great powers. In the silence of museum halls, where the few personal belongings of soldiers found in the ravines near Uman are kept, it seems that time has stood still. Pierced helmets, decayed wallets, unopened medallions, all are silent witnesses to how immense strength was sacrificed for the illusion of control. It is important to remember that behind every arrow on the map stood a person with their fears, hopes, and love for their loved ones. The Uman pocket will remain in history as a symbol of the greatest tragedy and, at the same time, as a monument to the resilience of spirit of those who continued to resist even when all hope had vanished. And in this eternal confrontation of truth and oblivion lies our duty: to know, to remember, and not to allow historical mistakes to become tradition. Analyzing the details of those days, we see how a mosaic of individual decisions forms the canvas of a catastrophe. On August 4, 1941, the staff of the Southwestern Front received a radiogram from Ponedelin, in which he explicitly stated, "Troops are exhausted, no ammunition, fighting to the last." The response was an order: "Hold on at all costs, help is near." This help consisted of several air raids that did not even reach their target due to Luftwaffe dominance. It was a conversation between the blind and the deaf. Moscow continued to believe in the magic of the words, "I order you to stand to the death," while flesh and blood on the ground could no longer withstand steel and fire. It is also interesting to consider how the German side viewed this battle. In the diaries of Wehrmacht officers, not only the triumph of the victors, but also genuine surprise shines through. They could not understand why Soviet troops had not retreated a week earlier, when all opportunities for it were open. Professional German military men saw this not as iron will, but as a senseless waste of valuable personnel. For them, Uman became confirmation that the Soviet command system was too cumbersome and dogmatic to survive in modern warfare. Fortunately for the world, this conclusion proved only partially true, and the lessons of Uman, albeit at a terrible cost, were nonetheless learned in the subsequent years of the war, when generals learned to assert their opinions and the Stavka, to trust the professionalism of its commanders. However, for those who remained in the Uman pocket in August of '41, these changes came too late. The fate of General Ponedelin is, perhaps, the most striking example of the injustice of that era. Having gone through German camps, preserving his dignity and loyalty to his oath after his liberation in '45, he was immediately arrested by Soviet security agencies. He spent 5 years in prison, hoping for rehabilitation. But in 1950, his life's journey was finally concluded by court sentence. Only years later, after a change in political course, his name was cleared of the traitor's stigma. This long return of truth underscores how deeply rooted the lie was, intended to hide the true culprits of the Uman defeat. The events of that summer near Uman also highlighted the problem of communication between the front and the rear. While a collapse was occurring at the front, official reports from the Sovinform Bureau spoke of continued stubborn battles in the Uman direction, suppressing the fact of the encirclement and capture of a huge number of people. This gap between the official picture of the world and reality became one of the reasons for the deep psychological breakdown in society in the first months of the war. People felt that something terrible was happening, but the lack of truthful information generated panic and rumors. Transparency and honesty in critical moments of history turn out to be no less important than the number of tanks and cannons. If we look at the geography of the Uman pocket, we will see that nature itself seemed to try to help the encircled. Numerous rivers, such as Yatran and Tikich, could have become natural defense lines if they had been occupied in time. But chaos in command led to bridges over these rivers being captured by German saboteurs before Soviet rearguards reached them. As a result, water barriers turned into traps for their own troops. The confusion reached such proportions that artillery regiments sometimes opened fire on their own, mistaking them for a breakthrough German landing force. In the absence of unified command, everyone saw an enemy in anyone who appeared from an unexpected direction. Decades after those events, search parties continue to find the remains of soldiers in the forests of the Green Brahma. Sometimes it is possible to restore names, to find relatives who all these years considered their grandfathers missing. Each such found soldier is another point in the endless list of losses that the country suffered because someone in Moscow was afraid to admit the obvious. These findings serve as a living reminder that history is never past. It is always present, demanding from us responsibility for memory. The Uman pocket is not only a story of defeat, it is a story of incredible strength of spirit. Even in the darkest hours, when commanders were lost and hope faded, there were simple lieutenants and sergeants who took responsibility and led people into battle. It was this grassroots initiative, despite the paralysis of the top, that ultimately became the seed from which victory later grew. Uman showed that an army consists not of arrows on a map, but of people capable of self-sacrifice, but who deserve competent and honest leadership. The tragedy near Uman also makes one reflect on the price of silence. How many officers at the front headquarters understood that a catastrophe was unfolding but did not dare to speak up, fearing for their careers or lives? This collective conformism became a breeding ground for the mistakes of the Stavka. When loyalty is valued above competence, defeat is only a matter of time. This principle remains relevant today, reminding us of the importance of professional ethics and civic courage in any sphere of human activity, especially where the cost of error is human life. Comparing Uman with other encirclements of the initial period of the war, for example, near Minsk or Smolensk, one can notice a common feature: an underestimation of the enemy's mobility and an overestimation of one's own capabilities to hold static lines. The German General Staff had perfectly mastered the art of operational encirclement, while the Soviet leadership continued to think in terms of the positional warfare of the First World War. A shift in thinking occurred only when the blood of millions of soldiers shed in such cauldrons as Uman forced the system to transform. The brutal School of 41 taught how to fight, but the price of this education was exorbitant. Today, a monument stands on the site of the former camp, Uman Pit. This is a modest reminder of those who went through hell on earth. Looking at these memorial signs, we must understand that behind them lies not only sorrow, but also a formidable warning. A warning that power, detached from reality, always pays for its mistakes with the blood of its people. The Uman Cauldron is a mirror in which all the vices and virtues of that era were reflected. From the inhumanity of tyranny to the sanctity of a soldier's duty. Walking through the streets of modern Uman, it is difficult to imagine that 85 years ago, the fate of an entire front was decided here. The city lives its own life, but the land beneath it preserves the memory of that scorching August. This memory is passed down in families, in the stories of veterans, in the books of historians who meticulously reconstruct the truth. And this truth is necessary for us not to reopen old wounds, but to build a society where the value of human life will be an unconditional priority, and responsibility for decisions made will be the norm of life. Ultimately, the Uman catastrophe teaches us that there are no minor mistakes in history. Every decision, made or not made at a critical moment, has long-term consequences. The stubbornness of the Stavka in July 41 led to the death of 2 armies, the loss of Ukraine, and created conditions for further defeats. But from this same ashes, a new understanding of war was born, which ultimately led the troops to Berlin. The path to triumph lay through terrible failures, and Uman will forever remain one of the most tragic and instructive pages of this path. Let this story serve as a reminder that behind any great achievements stand living people, their pain and their courage. We are obliged to remember every soldier whose path ended in Zelenaya Brama, every general whose name was unjustly blackened, and every lesson that was taught to us by that cruel era. In this endless cycle of memory and awareness lies the guarantee that our future will be brighter and more conscious than the past we recalled today under the dusty sky of Uman. Every year, when August arrives and the fields of Ukraine are covered with the gold of ripe wheat, it seems that the very air is filled with echoes of those distant events. This is not just history. It is part of our cultural and national code. We are the heirs of both those who made erroneous decisions and those who paid for them with their lives. And our task is to carry this knowledge through the years, without simplifying or distorting it, so that to the question, who is to blame, we can answer not by seeking scapegoats, but by a deep understanding of the complexity and tragedy of human choice in the millstones of history. The Uman Cauldron will forever remain in the shadow of larger battles, such as Stalingrad or the Battle of Kursk. But its significance for understanding the nature of that war cannot be overestimated. It was a moment of truth when masks were torn off, and everyone showed their true face. And if today we can freely discuss these events, analyze mistakes, and pay tribute to the fallen, it means that those sacrifices were not entirely in vain. Truth is the best monument we can erect to those who remained in Zelenaya Brama. Concluding our narrative, we once again see the same scorched fields and the same dusty roads. History has come full circle, returning us to the beginning of understanding. We leave this place with a heavy heart, but with a clear mind. May the lessons of Uman become for each of us an internal compass, helping us to distinguish true greatness from false pathos, courage from recklessness, duty from blind obedience. For ultimately, it is from these personal realizations that the history of mankind is formed, for which we all bear responsibility before future generations. The Uman tragedy is a call to vigilance, to the vigilance of reason, which must not allow slogans to replace reality, to the vigilance of the heart, which must empathize with every lost life, and to the vigilance of memory, which is our only defense against repeating the mistakes of the past. In this unity of reason, heart, and memory lies our strength, capable of overcoming any shadows of the past and guiding us to a world where such cauldrons will only be possible on the pages of history textbooks, as a reminder of what should never happen again. As we utter these lines, we are, as it were, offering a final salute to those who did not await reinforcements, who did not break out of encirclement, who died in the camp pit. Your silence today rings louder than any words, and in this sound is the hope that we have become wiser. May the earth lie lightly upon you, and our memory be an eternal light, illuminating your thorny path to immortality. History continues, and it is within our power to ensure that its new pages are written not with blood, but with creation and truth, for which you paid so dearly in August 1941 near Uman.